For 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke, it was a day that should have ended with her in the arms of her father. She was going to celebrate the holiday in their family home. But fate had a different plan. A plan that would forever change the course of her life. Without warning, Lansa Flight 508 was struck by lightning, and the world around Juliane dissolved into chaos. As the plane was ripped apart by the storm, she fell through the sky, still strapped to her seat, hurtling toward the dense jungle below. What followed is one of the most astonishing survival stories ever recorded. It was December 24, 1971. The day began like any other Christmas Eve for Juliane Koepcke. The 17-year-old was on Lansa Flight 508 with her mother, en route to Koepcke, Peru, where her father was eagerly awaiting their arrival. Juliane's parents were both renowned zoologists, and she had grown up surrounded by the wonders of nature, particularly in the lush rainforests of Peru. That day, the plan was simple: fly from Lima to Koepcke and spend the holidays together as a family. But nature had other plans. The flight had barely settled into its journey when the skies darkened, and the plane was engulfed in a fierce storm. Lightning crackled through the sky and illuminated the clouds in sharp, terrifying flashes. The turbulence grew worse by the minute, causing the aircraft to shudder violently. Passengers clung to their seats, and fear etched on their faces as the plane was tossed around like a toy in the winds. Then, without warning, a bolt of lightning struck the plane. In an instant, the aircraft was torn apart. Juliane found herself plummeting towards the earth, still strapped to her seat. It was a free fall from nearly 10,000 feet, but somehow, against all odds, Juliane survived the fall. How? Well, as she hurtled toward the ground, the thick canopy of the rainforest broke her fall, slowing her descent just enough to spare her life. She landed with a loud thud. She was unconscious and severely injured, but miraculously alive. Hours later, she opened her eyes to a world of green towering trees, thick vines, and an endless canopy that seemed to swallow the sky. For a moment, it was impossible to comprehend what had happened. Her body ached with pain, her vision was blurred, and her mind was struggling to piece together the events that had brought her to this place. She tried to move, but every inch of her body protested. Her collarbone was broken, and she had deep gashes on her legs and arms. One eye was swollen shut, and she could barely see out of the other. But the most terrifying realization was the absence of any other human being. There were no voices, no sounds of rescue, just the hum of insects, the distant calls of birds, and the rustle of leaves in the winds. She was utterly alone. At first, Juliane clung to the hope that her mother might be nearby, injured but alive. She called out for her. Her voice echoed through the tree, but there was no answer. With every passing minute, the reality of her situation became more and more terrifying. Despite the pain and fear, she knew she couldn't afford to give in to panic. Her parents had taught her well. She had grown up in the rainforest, and although she was injured and alone, she had more knowledge of this environment than most people could ever dream of. She knew that staying still meant certain death. She needed to find water, shelter, and some way to signal for help. With a supreme effort, Juliane forced herself to stand. She pushed through the pain. She knew from her parents' teachings that water was her best chance at finding people, so she began to follow the sound of a nearby stream. As she stumbled through the undergrowth, Juliane encountered the wreckage of the plane. The sight was devastating. Pieces of the aircraft were scattered across the jungle floor, twisted metal and broken seats lying among the trees. She found a few bodies, but none of them were her mother. The realization that she might be the only survivor weighed heavily on her, but she forced herself to keep moving. The hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Juliane knew that her injuries were severe, and that infection was a very real threat. The cuts on her body were already starting to attract insects, and the oppressive heat and humidity only made things worse. But she also knew that the stream she was following would eventually lead to a larger body of water, and possibly to people. As night began to fall, the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves were replaced by the eerie chorus of nocturnal creatures. The darkness was complete. Every sound seemed amplified. Every movement in the shadows was a potential threat. But Juliane had no choice but to keep moving. That first night in the jungle was the longest of Juliane's life. The pain, the fear, and the loneliness were overwhelming, but she refused to give up. She knew that she had already survived the impossible. If she could survive that, she could survive anything. The next day, her injuries became more severe. Her broken collarbone throbbed with every movement, and her deep cuts were becoming increasingly painful. the tropical heat only worsened her condition, and she knew that without proper care, her wounds would soon become infected. Sharp branches tore at her skin, and she had to wade through muddy, infested waters. Food was another challenge. The jungle was teeming with life, but most of it was either dangerous or inedible. Juliane had no tools to hunt or fish, and her only sustenance came from small fruits she recognized as safe. The lack of food weakened her further, and the days blurred together in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. Her body was deteriorating, but her will to survive remained strong. At night, the jungle transformed into an even more terrifying place. Juliane's fear was constant, but she pushed it to the back of her mind, focusing instead on the one thing that kept her going, the thought of her father. She knew he would be searching for her, and she was determined to stay alive until help arrived. As the days passed, Juliane's situation grew more desperate. Her wounds were becoming infected, and she was losing strength rapidly. But then, on the 10th day, she saw something that renewed her hope: a small boat. It was half submerged in the water and tied to the bank of a larger river. It was a sign that people were nearby. Summoning the last of her strength, she followed the riverbank, and soon she came across a small shack. It was empty, but it was clear that someone had been there recently. Although she couldn't stay in the shack, but it offered her a place to rest. She drank water from a tin she found inside and cleaned her wounds as best she could. That night, she slept on the wooden floor. She didn't know if the people who lived there would return, but it was her only hope. On the 11th day, Juliane's ordeal finally came to an end. She was lying in the shack, too weak to move, when she heard voices outside. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. After all, she had been alone for so long. But the voices were real. A group of local loggers had returned to the shack, and when they saw her, they could hardly believe their eyes. Here was a young girl, half dead from her injury, alone in the middle of the Amazon. The loggers quickly took her in, gave her food and water, and cleaned her wounds as best they could. They listened in shock as she told them her story. They knew the jungle well, and they knew how many dangers it held. For Juliane to have made it through, with nothing but her wits and determination, was beyond their understanding. The loggers wasted no time in getting Juliane to safety. They took her down the river to a nearby village, where she was cared for by the local people. From there, news of her survival spread quickly, and soon arrangements were made to fly her back to Koepcke, where her father was waiting. The reunion was heartbreaking. Her father had feared the worst, but against all odds, his daughter had come back to him, alive.